Bruno Gouliel-Minetti, je suis l'animateur du podcast d'actualité numérique Mon Carnet. Je suis très heureux de vous accueillir pour ce panel et qui va être fort intéressant parce qu'on va parler de cadres, c'est-à-dire juridiques, de cadres de loi dans le domaine des infrastructures essentielles. Et on va faire ça en anglais. Alors, si vous avez besoin d'un casque pour suivre la conversation, je vous invite à le faire. So, from now on, I'll take my best English to do the rest of the talking. But since you'll be doing the talking, hey, I don't need that much English. First of all, well, as you see, they're properly seated, so now you'll be able to know who's who and their title, so I'm skipping that part. First of all, before we get to our discussion, what would be, just to see where you sit about the subject, what would be your definition of critical infrastructure? What do you include in that list? I don't know which one want to start with this. Well, Patrick?
Why don't you start?
Okay, I'll start. I am a recovering regulator for the U.S. for critical infrastructure, so I'll just disclose that up front. In the U.S., we define critical infrastructure through basically 16 sectors. Now, there are more critical infrastructures than others. The core sector 5 are electric, gas, water, wastewater, and chemical. And then outside of that, you start getting into financial and healthcare and other support infrastructures.
And Danielle or Vanessa, would you include more stuff in it?
I guess I would include anything digital that provides support to society daily. Telecommunications, e-commerce, anything that we need to operate our society every day.
Okay.
So since I'm a lawyer, I'll start with what the law says. So in Canada, we have 12 sectors that are considered critical infrastructure. We call them essential infrastructure because we like to be slightly different. But out of these 12 industries that range from, let's say, the treatment of water all the way to healthcare, what is interesting is that during the pandemic, you've seen these industries grow bigger in terms of what is defined as healthcare or what is defined as food supply. So you had this application from which you ordered maybe cookies at night. That has become your only way to get some food, and that application is now a critical infrastructure. We've seen the same thing in finance. A lot of fintech just wanted to do something for fun and now ended up as rails for the government, and they have to comply with additional requirement. So I would say that although the law says very restrictively what sector is critical infrastructure, in practice it comes with a bunch of suppliers and vendors that are associated to that sector.
So it's becoming a huge environment.
Much bigger than we think, because these are publicly funded environment very often. And then you also have all the complex that relates to national security that is big in itself. So nowadays I have clients that do not know they are critical infrastructure. I have to tell them that, like, did you know you're critical infrastructure? And maybe you need to look at Public Safety Canada about what to do next.
Patrick, having heard Vanessa, would you like to review your definition?
No, I think that's a fantastic definition. And like yours, you emphasized digital at the beginning. And I think the hardest part is for us to create finite, distinct verticals for each of these, because in some cases, think of communications as an critical infrastructure, but it is essentially the fabric for all of the other infrastructures. Yep. The same with electricity, for example, or even gas, finance. So it is more of a complex ecosystem or a complex kind of web of interdependencies amongst all of them. But in order for us to conceptually regulate them, we have to find some construct, and we end up with kind of what service they provide as a construct for that. Vendors are all the same across the board in a lot of cases, whether it's the technology vendors or other platforms. So it's challenging when it comes from a regulatory perspective. If you just regulate one vertical at a time, well, you're regulating like one section of all of these interdependent components. So it's very challenging when you try to regulate across a suite of them at different times with different methods under different agencies. So that it's not just complex in the concept of what is infrastructure and where does it stop and begin, but how do you regulate this?
Well, that's a good question. And you're bringing me to my other question. What do you see being, and I have a lot of difficulty with that word in English. It's my worst nightmare. With the regulatory Framework for critical infrastructure protection, because that's the main key question. I mean, what do you see being included in it? What would it be? And you might have some example because you've been through that.
Yeah. We started in the U.S. with NERC-CIP, and this started, believe it or not, back in 1998. It was a presidential decision directive. I was one of the original authors back in 2001. It took us about 8 to 10 years to actually get it mandatory and enforceable by law.
Wow.
It was a long time kind of voluntary work that was done. Then it became mandatory and enforceable, and we had penalties and sanctions for not following the regulations, which of course has a lot of unintended consequences. Things that we really didn't expect. So I think that the challenge is, as I mentioned, when you're trying to regulate multiple different infrastructures, because your goal overall is to have society in general be safe and secure and have the things that they need. When you start with just one or others, you end up with kind of inconsistencies, and it's a patchwork that you're working with. So one thing we've recently done in the U.S. is released what are known as the cyber performance goals. They're voluntary for now, like most regulation starts out voluntary, and then you're voluntold, and then you're just told. But with this approach, we're actually trying to measure those 5 sectors I mentioned earlier, the most critical ones that we've decided, across the same playing field.
Okay.
So we're looking at the same measurements for all of these different infrastructures the same way, which is a unique undertaking so far from what I've seen. So we'll see what kind of unintended consequences we get from this effort, but for now, it looks rather promising.
But it's feasible to have
Yes.
kind of trying to find something, quote unquote, equal that you can measure everything?
Yes, I think the bigger challenge, at least we've seen with trying to roll out regulations in infrastructure, is it's often seen as the ceiling versus the floor.
Yeah.
So instead of, you must be this tall to ride the ride, that's what they now set as the top bar of their effort. So it's a bit of a different challenge in trying to get them to go above and beyond that minimum. That's where we're starting with these performance goals that help them kind of provide some incentive to do so. But at the same time, we're also looking at getting cyber insurance involved, for example, or the market involved to have some other kind of invisible hand factors in normalizing security across all of those Sector 5 verticals.
Okay. Daniel, so if I'm asking the question to you, what do you see being included in that framework?
Yeah, I think that's all changing. I mean, if we look at the 20th century, we're talking about bridges and ports. This is hard infrastructure that we can monitor and put men with guns there to support and oversee. But as we look at telecommunications, 5G, 6G eventually, satellite, I mean, we're moving into an arena where there's an ecosystem of overlapping infrastructure that bleeds into each other. It becomes much more difficult to look at as vertically separated systems. So I think it'll be much trickier going forward than it's been in the past. Still manageable, I hope, but different.
Would you say that, and I'm kind of thinking about the first answer that you given me, being adding the digital and the infrastructure. So that's the big key element that's changing the game.
Essentially, data.
Yeah.
I mean, if we look at Canada, for example, so much of our data travels to the United States, right, through the pipes that make up the infrastructure for North America. And so in that sense, we are dependent upon a system-wide infrastructure that is cross-national or transnational. And if you look at the internet, then it moves into the world as a whole. And I mean, there's lots of issues around geopolitics we could get into, which I do. But there's a lot of debate or struggle or conflict about decoupling, what that means in the digital space, and how that'll impact how we manage and monitor these systems.
Patrick, I saw you.
Yeah, we're definitely, there's balkanization of the internet. I mean, there are countries that will just break themselves off. It is sometimes considered a good idea. Most of the time it's considered a bad idea because we do everything over the internet now. So commerce, communications, many other things. And in the US, same thing. Much of our data flows through Europe and flows through Canada. It's just, packets don't have boundaries.
Vanessa, from the point of view of a lawyer, should we put everything in that infrastructure?
So I'm going to make a distinction between how do we regulate it and what do we regulate, right? So the thing is, Canada has a broad approach to what is a critical infrastructure. There are 12 different sectors, and not all of these sectors are federally regulated. Some of them are provincially regulated, and some of them do not have the same fundings, talking about healthcare, than others, talking about military, let's say. So starting from that principle, how do we regulate it? We have to start by thinking, what is the role of the provinces and what is the role of the federal government? And then we end up with a system that's great that we see in the US. And Patrick, I'm happy you're there because there's a system in the US where federal entities and those suppliers of the federal entities relate to the National Institute of Standard and Technology to understand what they should do as federal entities, and it has become some sort of standard in society. That doesn't exist today in Canada, it doesn't exist in Quebec, but the Law 6 has created the Ministry of Cybersecurity, and one of the power they have is to pass some technical regulation. So what I'm expecting is that they will actually regulate through technical regulation that will be similar to NIS, what should be done in each of the critical infrastructure under their competencies. And that's one of the goals of the law. If you read the law, it's the third goal at the top of it is to help the critical infrastructure. Now the federal, they have something going on. They have classification of information, and they have certification from sites. So they have a whole different system in place. So we gotta be very careful when we say regulating critical infrastructure, and I don't wanna sound like a lawyer, but it depends.
Patrick, you've been mentioning that on the stage you've been doing that for a long time, but obviously the pictures change with the arrival of digital in our new reality. Do you see, and you can be chauvinist if you want to, but do you see good practice being done by some countries to nowadays with the new reality?
I do, and it's regulation by a specific nation is unique to that nation. Canada has the NERC-CIP standards as well, but they're implemented province by province, not at a federal level. So each province is basically at a different space. But then again, you don't have a lot of interprovincial transmission lines for those things, so it makes sense. So it's going to have to fit your unique country's situation. I've seen similar regulation, for example, in Europe or in South America. In South America, most of these systems are owned by the nation. They're federally owned or state-owned. So there's not a lot of private institutions that run these things. So it's easier for them to implement regulation on things that they own. There's not a lot of other private interest involved. Yeah. So it again, not to sound like a lawyer or a regulator or a consultant, which I am, it depends. So we have like the NIS or NIS2 now in Europe, which is across all of Europe. It is, again, a minimum threshold to meet, and but it's something that they've all been able to agree upon. So the hard part is just getting everybody, first of all, to agree that this is what we're going to do. The biggest challenge is, we kind of know what works from a security standpoint. We know roughly what our threat actors are doing. Yeah. We can kind of roughly see the trajectory the technology is taking in each of the infrastructures. It's just getting everybody to agree in there with an interest as to whether or not they're going to put the money in, because security is not cheap. It costs, it impacts everything.
But going back, because you've been mentioning some countries and what they were doing, but going back to my question, do you see best practice somewhere that you could pin them up and say, well, that's a good country. You could.
I haven't seen one that's really gotten this right.
That sends out?
Yeah, they're all still. We're all still trying to watch each other and see what they've done. And the hard part is you're comparing, very different systems against very different systems. So there really isn't a very good basis for comparison. So we're kind of, I call it the Vegas buffet. You go there and there's everything in front of you, and you want the pizza and the brownie, and you just kind of have to decide what you want and what fits you best and what your appetite is. But the main thing is we're not immature anymore. We know what works and what doesn't. So now it's just a matter of picking from what works for your fit, your model, your country, your infrastructure, and applying it. But again, that causes a lot of friction.
Okay. Danielle, you work really on the international level. So from your point of view, do you see some country having more best practice than others?
At the regulatory level? Or?
Yeah.
Well, everyone always points out Estonia when it comes to infrastructure and data, digital, cyber. I mean, there's
Well, at least they were the first to do it.
Yeah,
Well,
and I
one
mean,
of
they're
the
a small
first.
country.
Yeah.
Singapore, Dubai,
Yeah.
these are other countries
Okay,
that come to mind.
okay.
But I mean, United States, much larger, more fragmented to a certain degree. Canada, too, larger. So it's more difficult, I think, for larger countries to try to imitate Estonia, for example. But to take it as an example is good. It's useful. I think there's value there. The other thing I was going to bring up, maybe
Please do.
to pivot slightly, you can regulate from the top down, but you can also work with the developers to regulate from the bottom up. So it's important to build a confluence of interests, different communities that can come together, legal scholars, academics, and tech developers to work on, say, AI and machine learning, right? An area that's really quite difficult to pin down in regulatory terms. It's something that we can do as separate communities, or we could do together, right? And I think working together is much better overall.
But do you see that happening often?
Well, I work with an organization that's trying to do that, so I'm not going to. It's called World Legal Summit. Check it out.
Well, you should.
Yeah, so every 2 years we host several summits around the world that bring together legal scholars and academics and tech developers to work on it. Whatever we think of is a sort of like, it's been blockchain for some time in AI. I'm sure there'll be other examples going down, like quantum computing, for example. But technology gets ahead of the regulatory systems.
Yep.
Sometimes much further ahead, and so it can be very difficult for regulators to show up and say this is what we should do. If you look at cryptocurrencies, and it's good to have them in one room if possible to have that conversation.
Vanessa?
Well, I would say if there's a buffet, Canada is in front of the buffet and doesn't know what to eat, right? We fill the plate with all kinds of things, and we don't know where we're going with that. And that's how it feels. I'm not going to say that the U.S. maybe has mastered it, but if you work with EdTech in the US, there's standards of how data interoperability has to occur. There are standards on security. There are variations between states that are quite annoying when you're a lawyer, but for a client, if you kind of pick the golden standard, you'll be fine. Whereas we don't have this today, right? And some of these standards cost nothing to apply for these schools because they just have to say to the vendor, you gotta comply with this. So one thing that I think the US does well is putting in place standards in different industries, even in an industry where basically if you go to a school, there's nobody that's qualified to do that. So they're giving them the tools so that they can actually regulate through this. They also have a lot of requirement for suppliers and suppliers of suppliers, which is what I call soft law in a way. And what I like to say is probably more effective than any regulation we'll put in place and what people do not see, because that's all behind the curtain. And the other thing that's interesting is when you look at the European Union, there's many countries that are now agreeing to one norm, and that's a strength. That's something that we don't have in Canada, and knowing that not every province has the same means, the same risk, having one standard that we can all rally behind would be clearer. But then from there on, if every country has a standard, what do I do if I'm an international country? How annoying is that, right? And then why do we have international standard if there's provincial standard and is there country-based standard? So at some point, somebody's going to need to map this and say this is the worldwide minimum gold standard so you can operate, right?
Yeah,
Patrick?
I call this the Rosetta Stone for regulation. I mean, we do need something like that, and I've tried this before with whether it's NERC-CIP or NIS2 or CAF in the UK or BSI in Germany, and it's you end up with you're really looking at security controls. Now, in some frameworks, the controls are larger bucket versus smaller components. So you have to pick one as a frame of reference and then map it to the others. So what you don't get is kind of a many-to-many map. You get a one-to-many map, and you just have to pick which one you want to focus on as your organization or your local, regional, whatever provincial regulation may be. So it can be done. It's actively been done. We've all done these before, but it's a painful exercise. But for you to effectively operate as an international organization, you don't have a choice, unfortunately.
And yeah.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. He's right. I mean, when it's that fragmented, it can be very tricky. For the private sector, I've worked with tech companies that are trying to figure out this. If you want to work internationally, you want to work with Europe, for example, and you have to recognize that they have a much more robust regulatory system, or they're moving in that direction. Let's say if it's not complete, it makes it challenging if you come from a country that doesn't have that, right? And you need to spend a lot of money to adapt to it. It's difficult.
But at the same time, when I'm hearing that from you, I'm thinking about more and more. I mean, for the last maybe 2 years, there's a lot of countries who have been raising the issue of sovereignty, digital sovereignty. So where does it sit? Because I'm hearing you, Vanessa, saying that or maybe Patrick, what you were bringing, we need to find a simple way to do it, but at the same time, all those countries who are looking to make sure that they are kinging their own digital domain. So is there something that's difficult to get between those two aspects?
I don't know if I have an answer to that.
Well, just try me.
When I look at this a different way, are you asking, is there something that's normalizing all of this? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the universal normalizing effect I've seen is insurance.
Wow.
Yeah. It seems to be one of the only things that, I mean, other than regulation, that gets these organizations to move in meaningful ways. So yeah, and it's right now. I would argue that we're at a stage where we're seeing the pendulum swing back from insurance because they came into it with models of like 1990s, hurricane approaches for cyber, which of course they found out didn't work. Surprise. So they're backing off, and a lot of the infrastructure organizations would buy cyber insurance if they could, but they're getting questions like, do you have multi-factor authentication? And like, well, we have a bunch of, digital assets, but they're industrial things, and they don't do that. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of talking past each other. So the discussion still has to happen to make it better. But I think once the insurance industry gets a grip on this, it will have a very significant normalizing effect across everything.
That's an interesting point of view, Vanessa. From a lawyer point of view.
Well, actually, I really like when you talk about digital sovereignty, because one thing we don't want to come across is, so we found the solution, so let's take my solution and all of yours are wrong, right? First, there are cultural ideas behind laws. Laws are adopted because there are consensus of social norms. So importing a law from another country is dangerous and shouldn't be done. Like, for example, the GDPR works well in the European Union because they have a right to data protection, not a right to privacy. Yep. We have a right to privacy in Quebec, not in Canada. We have an implicit right to privacy. So how we approach this is very different. And what is privacy for one person to another person, that too is very cultural. So it has been hard for privacy to reach a certain level of we all agree, right? But for security, when it comes to a configuration to Microsoft, that's a little bit easier. So there are probably some common consensus we could all agree to that could allow countries to work well from one critical infrastructure to another one. But then we still have to be careful. So in China, there are rules requiring internet service providers that they cannot delete the information, which is it's at odds with the GDPR, which requires the deletion of information. And that's, I think, planned. That's purposely at odds, right? There's no intention here to adopt the GDPR. But that comes from a different perspective. But when it comes to configuration, certainly there's things we can agree on. We've seen it around ISO standards. So I think there's a way to preserve what is the digital sovereignty and the right of every community in every country to choose a solution that fits their need while agreeing on which configuration works so that we could work with other countries as well.
Danielle, do you see that issue being raised?
Well, obviously, yeah. I mean, when we're talking about, the way I see the world basically is two giant gravitational centers of data gravity, one in China, one in the United States, and the European Union trying to navigate in between these two. And I think what we're seeing is potentially over the long term, two different worlds, two different ecosystems, or maybe more. Frankly, it could be more than two. But I think that might be a good thing ultimately because it's a competition to arrive at certain ends. How do we leverage machine learning? How do we develop new and innovative systems? How do we manage people's data? How do we deal with surveillance capitalism and platform models. I mean, it's good to have different systems in operation to experiment with different approaches. Some will arrive at different goals and through different means, and we'll all learn from that. You know, I think that's a good thing. I think right now we're in a state where we're looking at these platform models and with a certain kind of frustration, right? Are they really good for us? Is this the direction we want to go with capitalism? I think that's a question that's emerging anyway. I don't know if there's an answer to that, but that's what we're exploring.
No, it's unhealthy.
I hear a challenge then, and I was curious to ask you, when you're looking at that question about regulating the infrastructure, where do you see from your past experience, but also with the issue that we've been raising, where do you see the challenges? What are the key things that have to be fixed so we can...
You can write regulation. And honestly, slow regulation is the best regulation. Fast, knee-jerk reaction is always terrible regulation.
Like to be agile.
But the challenge is writing legislation or regulation that can survive the changes in technology. So it will never be timeless, but it will be better time, I guess, buffered. So your goal is to write something that can live as long as possible and still allow you the mechanisms to catch up with technology as it... I mean, hackers are faster than laws. Technology is faster than laws every single time.
And this is not the fact today.
This is
most
true.
Of the
this is true right now. I mean, we wrote, for example, the NERC SIP standards. We have to revise them. I mean, minimum once or twice a year. There is several pieces of this up for change because technology changes. So we have to constantly change the regulation to match the pace of technology. But writing fast regulation is inherently bad because you often narrowly scope it and you don't put enough thought process and deliberation into it to actually create something that can live longer because you're just trying to put Band-Aids on things as fast as you can. So those solutions are more difficult. So taking a slower, more deliberate approach to writing as much as a time-proof as possible regulation that you can create is certainly the best approach. It's very difficult. And I think in a lot of cases, some emergency will happen. Some company gets hacked, some infrastructure gets hacked, people are affected, and we immediately rush out there and start throwing laws around and making sure, oh, well, this will never happen again. We'll just solve it with a new law, which is a very bad idea. So if there is a method to get in front of this in a proactive, deliberate method with the intention of trying to make it as time-proof as possible, building in the mechanisms to update it frequently in a meaningful way is the best approach. Many governments fail at this. They're not really good at this kind of thing. So,
but do you see regulator? Let's say in the States. Do you see regulator going that way?
We're trying to do that in the States, but we've done it. We're getting better at it, but it's only because we've tried so many other methods and they failed. So we're hopefully learning from our mistakes in the process.
Wow. Thank you for being honest like that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, no. Yeah, I've seen the sausage being made from the inside. I'm the first person to say it's an absolutely terrible process.
And we're not really talking about sausage. We're talking about the law, just to make sure. Daniel, where do you see the challenges?
Well, one overarching challenge as I see it is that, this term law is code. I think that code is becoming in many ways the determiner of how our systems operate. So the regulators are critical because they provide guidelines or some kind of boundaries. But the truth is the code goes ahead anyway. And whatever's built into that code will determine our e-commerce systems, most of our transactions that are becoming the basis of everything we do. How our data is managed and saved and stored and leveraged and exploited. And so, I think that in some respects, government has to bring into itself developers at a high level to begin to manage how code builds law, or implicitly becomes law one way or the other.
Wow.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yeah.
Excellent statement. We don't have building codes for code. Like when you build a structure, it has to have certain materials. It has to be expected by an engineer at certain stages. We don't have that yet in our code. And we're building digital structures. We're building digital worlds without building codes. That's a fundamental problem.
No,
that's a great point, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Auditors, for example, we could do that too.
Yeah, that would be. Vanessa? the challenges?
Well, the first thing I'll do is I'll challenge the question, right? Because it says, how should we regulate? First question is, should we regulate in the first place, right? So what's a regulation? A regulation is taken pursuant to a law, right? And what it does is it put into as part of a legal system and not as part of a technical standard. It creates a new norm. So it costs money to do, costs money to verify, costs money to update, and it's slow to update. So first option is, why don't we pass standards, right? Which is the option that Quebec is going with, if I'm understanding the law of the ministry. Because standards can be changed overnight. Standards can be updated. You can be trained on a standard. You can be certified on a standard. You can't do none of that with a regulation. That's number one. Number two, if there's a regulation, who's going to enforce it? Do I need to have some specialists that we don't already have for the critical infrastructure,
Yes.
take them in the government, and then tell them what they should do, but then they don't have resources to do it, right? Because that's what happens in the end. And then think about these infrastructure that don't have money because the government are not funding them, but then the government is funding other people to tell them what to do, but they still don't have money. So there's an issue with regulation that way. And then regulation loses its credibility when it's not applied. Now, having said this, there are norms of engineering that for planes, there's norm of engineering for all kinds of things, and it is doable to do it, but they're done by professional who are certified also that is overseeing a project. So I think people are very quick to take the law, the route of having a law or having regulation, but that's not necessarily what we need in all industries.
Say, that was the applause word for you. I saw you reacting to.
Yeah. When we made these early regulations in the U.S., the hard part of it wasn't writing the regulation, wasn't writing the standard, because actually it's a good separation.
Yes.
We regulate to a standard. So that way the regulation says, follow the standard. The standard can change, the regulation doesn't have to change as much. So that's so far been an effective approach for us. The hard part was the monitoring and enforcement component. So now you send out auditors. Are they qualified? And they write penalties and sanctions against these companies for not following the standard and the regulation. So I would rather have, frankly, a mediocre standard or regulation, but a very high quality monitoring and enforcement program that does it well. Because if you write it and say do it, but you don't follow through with it, and it becomes everyone can violate and no one really cares, well then why do it? So that part of it is, I would say, the trickier and harder challenge than the regulation or the standard is the monitoring and enforcement component that goes into backing it.
Vanessa?
And if I want to add too, it's for the judge to understand what's been written.
Right.
They're still trying to understand what is a cloud, right? And maybe because we
Someone
use
else's computer.
Yeah, and we use these words that are so hard for them to understand. There's a hacker, there's a cloud, and then there's a blockchain. And in the end, what you mean is there's a wire to a machine. Well, why don't you say that? So it makes it very difficult for them to understand how to apply it. So that's why the federal government in Canada wants to have a data tribunal, because the truth is, I've looked at the decision and it's not all very clear that the judge has understood the technology. So does that mean we're going to need another tribunal again? And do we have the money for that? Do we even have a judge qualified for this? Whereas an industry-led program actually has the expertise because it's made by the industry. So there's a value to what's been mentioned before about regulating from the bottom up, and then let's see what the industry does, and then let's see if it's worth putting that into a standard or a regulation rather than try to impose on people that we don't even understand their job, right?
Yeah. But Vanessa, you're bringing me to my next question. Is hearing what you're saying, I'm kind of wondering, do we need to wait another generation to make sure that everybody who's in charge is able to understand what the heck is happening?
We'll end up waiting another generation anyway. We'll try it now. When we may get good at it, we may not. The answer is it will likely be better understood in a generation. Until then, it will be very disruptive. And honestly, that's to be expected. We don't have any really good answer for this. I can't take judges aside and train them all up.
No.
I do that for executives right now and boards, and it's very challenging. They're trying to get up to speed. They want to understand. So I think it's incumbent upon us to help them understand as best we can, but it will be disruptive for a while, and we will likely make some missteps along the way.
I think if we wait a generation, there's going to be no power grid to save.
Daniel?
Yeah, I was going to say that, I mean, I don't know the answer to this question. I worry about it too. I mean, are we moving too slow? You know, is the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure that's emerging, advancing so quickly that, you know, it is a generational shift that is jarring? I think we probably should do more than we are doing. I also think that we will be playing catch up for a long time to come, regardless of how fast we move. But I think it is a generational shift.
And the question is also, is there that field of expertise somewhere? I mean, well equipped for 2023, 24.
It's getting better. I mean, I'm sure you're doing the same thing. We're all doing the same thing. I mean, I work with a lot of regulators to get them up to speed on the technical terms, and we walk them through training programs. And so I've written this for the National Association of State Regulators in the U.S. and for various different, all of the different sectors. Getting them educated on it is the challenge. Some of them want to be Luddites. They don't want to advance, so they want to stick to what they know. Some of them want to know. So you're not just looking at, you know, can they be trained, is do they even want to be trained is the first question. And the ones that do want to be trained, yes, but are there enough of us to go around to get them up to speed? I mean, even in the insurance space, they're hiring like real professionals from the field to come in and be underwriters because they don't have anybody that speaks cyber or digital in any way. So it's right now we're all interestingly enough kind of cannibalizing each other for knowledge and expertise and hopefully trying to shift the landscape and move the needle in a better direction. But you're fighting two opposing forces. There are groups that just do not want to advance, and there are some that are advancing so fast that there is no way to catch them.
Wow.
I think one issue is that the needle is moving up on the hourly rate of the consultant more than anything else. And what we have to be careful here is that we have these businesses or these organizations that are built on old IT systems, so they have catch up to do. And then we have the new ones that are being built where we can make a difference there. You can do security by design from day one, and that's not the same expertise. So we have to understand which critical infrastructures are vulnerable already, like power grids. They already have intruders. What can we do? And maybe we can't fix it. Maybe we need to build another one that's a redundancy, right? So we need to go and ask what is best for each of the client. And if you're building something new, then it's probably easier to do security by design than try to fix one of these big pipeline where you have a convergence of IT and OT that, you know, and you have a tons of legacy systems that are not maintained anymore. So I'm not going to say that everything is lost, but I'm going to say not everything deserves to be fixed. Sometimes we just need to replace with something that's working better.
Daniel, you wanted to add something on this?
Yeah, I was going to add that I also think there's some room to be in higher education to start looking at digital trades, you know, like re-examining what exactly people are going to graduate and do. I mean, even if you're working as a plumber, you're probably going to be interfacing with some sort of IoT system in some form, right? Or digital twin. And I think that's happening. I'm not to be too dismissive. I have a PhD and I have a bit of a criticism of academia based on my experience. But I think that there's, you know, a generational transition has to feed through all of our institutions. And no one gets out of that, right? Including the education system. Everyone has to change, basically. Yeah.
Since I have you, I have to ask you that question. It wasn't planned, but you made me think about it. We didn't touch the metaverse. No, because we're talking about a real world.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
But let's push maybe in 10 years. Metaverse might be a reality.
It already is a reality. Yeah.
So we'll have the same issue in the metaverse.
Yeah, it'll have the same issue, and it'll have different issues and more issues. Yeah, because
But we are, it's a way of saying it. But we'll have the same reality that we will need some regulation in that area.
We will.
So we will have to redo everything again, or should we start from the scratch and make sure that we're building it with standard?
I can only hope that we get ahead of it and build it with security in mind and front, but it will likely be reactive like everything else has always been, unfortunately.
I don't like your answer. But that's the truth. So
I've been doing this for too long. It's mostly reactive, but it does lead, each reactive step leads slight bits of more proactive components that come along with it. So, I mean, the answer is yes, it will be the same problems just in a virtual digital space. and they'll have corollaries to the physical world, but they will be
impacting
purely
the
digital.
people in the company.
Yeah.
Still. Danielle?
Yeah, I don't know about metaverse. I'm not persuaded by this, but I think, in terms of digital twins, having digital systems that are moderating and mediating all of our physical infrastructure, that's definitely the case. And I think there has to be, whether it's operating system level or it's an auditing level or regulatory level, there has to be a lot of oversight, because the room for monkey business that's going to come with this next generation of digital society is substantial. I worry about
Vanessa?
that.
I'm not sure that I'm a fan of metaverse either. I know
but
that
you will have a lot of clients in there.
Yes. So one thing is, I don't think there should be any critical infrastructure on the metaverse, or at least not just yet. And the second question, and I'm not talking about the metaverse as a technology, but the metaverse, how is it used? Always the first question is, should it be used for that? Not is it safe?
Oh, wow.
Should it be used first? Because remember these very nice glasses that you can spy with people on it. What did the European data protection regulator says? It says, great privacy by design, but the idea is bad. And it's true, because from there on, you can just put a little sticker that will hide the little camera and nobody will know. So it doesn't matter what you put in the product, because the idea is bad in the first place. The issue with metaverse is a little bit the same issue than with IoT. People are putting it in dolls, they're putting it in all kinds of things that you don't even know why somebody would want to put an internet connection in there. And what we see on the metaverse today is a lot of shops, a lot of marketing. It's a technology that will be interesting maybe in different contexts, like the Bitcoin led to something else, like the metaverse will lead to something else. But today, as it stands today, there shouldn't be any critical infrastructure there and shouldn't be any expectations of privacy in the current state of the metaverse.
Wow. That's a good conclusion. Thank you. Do you have any question for our guest? Please, if you just go to the microphone.
Hi there. I'm not sure if everyone heard the news about Elon Musk upping the price to the enrollment to $20. That would definitely shut down on a lot of fake Trumps logging in, right? So,
by the way, now it's $8.
Sorry?
He updated the information.
Yeah, he
it's
changed
$8.
it to 8.
So could, in fact, the enforcement of paying for authentication, and much like credit bureaus credentialize and authenticate for the financial market, could we essentially create these circles of trust or notarized systems, peer-reviewed systems that allow for everyone to have their own good guy database versus a bad guy database, and essentially at one point the AI will squeeze everybody that's bad out. But what do you think about Elon upping the price and allowing for discrepancies to happen, and he's creating a check mark of verification? Is it a matter of paying more for accessibility, or is it a matter of the authentication portal securing us now with these tamper-resistant biometric seals of sorts?
Well, thanks for that question.
Thank you.
Who wants to take it?
I think it's all of the above. I don't think it's neither or. I mean, a filter that facilitates actual people, it's not a bad thing, right?
Yeah.
How you get there, I'm sure there are a lot of different routes to it, but...
Okay.
Yeah, I think the filter that filters out actual people versus, bots or non-people, that might be of interest, but good or bad depends on who's in power. So that is a completely different discussion, and we don't have time for that.
It's another panel.
Right.
Vanessa, you want to add something on it?
What I see that is so interesting about this is really the beginning of a new era where the next lawsuits will require that you disclose your algorithm, will require that you disclose this code, and then we're going to have to settle on a definition of what fairness means in AI. So it's a brave new world where we just switch from privacy to discrimination, AI, and data governance at a larger level.
Wow, thanks. Next question, please.
Bonjour, Vincent Doré, Innovation, Sciences et Développement économique Canada. Vous avez parlé, sorry, I'll go to English.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
You've talked about new technology, playing catch up, and there's a phrase I'm hearing frequently is secure by default. And I was thinking, should this be an approach, as you said, kind of in terms of regulation, should it be regulated? Should new technology comes with an obligation to have security in mind, whether it be digital or tangible?
Short answer is yes.
Thank you.
But how do we get there? So I'll give you an example. We just put in the U.S. It's labeling for IoT, IIoT, kind of the consumer-based products. So you've seen like an Energy Star rating on your refrigerator or your water heater that says it's going to be this efficient over the life of the product, or a nutrition label on the food that you eat. So they're trying to do something like that with the technologies. So it will, right now we're starting with, it's going to be shipped to you in its default configuration when you buy it at that point in time with this level of security. Okay. So you'll know when you buy it. It's up to you to maintain it, and the threat landscape changes, all of those things aside, right? Another discussion. Following after that will be something like a software bill of materials, which will look kind of like an ingredients list. So at least you'll kind of know what's in your soup. You know, if you're allergic to garlic, you'll know it's in there. So it's not perfect, but it's a non-regulatory way to drive the market through basically a mandate that says you at least have to disclose what is in your product, and when you're buying it with this level of assurance out front. Is it secure by default? Maybe, maybe not. Of course, that changes over time, but when you bought it, you at least know what you're buying when you're at the consumer level. Yes.
Danielle, Vanessa? No.
Well, so far as Quebec is concerned, and there's personal data that are processed by that system, there is that requirement. It is in the law. It's not enforced yet. It's going to be enforced in a few months, but that requirement is there. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. And I'm talking about all of these cloud systems that takes a week and a half to configure. And what does that mean? That it's supposed to be confidentiality by default. But that only concerns personal data. So far as critical infrastructure are concerned, there's actually no law that says you got to sell something secured to a critical infrastructure, right? But there's something to do around this, around export control. What can be exported to another country? So for example, there's nothing that's going to prevent an Italian firm from exporting a malware and sell it to another government. And why is that? That's completely crazy, right? So there are rules we can do around how technology should be commercialized. There are tools that are there, and they're not used today. So I think we just need to be a little bit more imaginative. We've done what we could with the personal data. Let the law run for a few years, but there's more than personal data out there.
Thank you. Let's take a last question, sir.
Hi. As a consultant, I get to work every day in a NERC-CIP environment, and it's...
I'm very sorry.
So it's no easy to get there, so it's... so for every work you do in cybersecurity control, we say as a joke, you do it tenfold as compliance. So if we were to roll in more and more regulatory consideration in other critical infrastructure, are we going to be building some kind of regulation on top of an empty basket? And is there any emerging consideration to enhance the actual workforce, because there's no regulation without people enforcing it? So how do you see that happening?
Okay, bear with me. This is what I was talking about earlier about the monitoring and enforcement component. The reason you do 10 times the work in the compliance side is you're demonstrating your compliance to the regulator. And the problem with this is the NERC standards were written in what's called a performance-based monitoring method. So you have to show a mountain of evidence to show that you've done the work to be compliant. They don't tell you how to get there. They just say you've got to get there. So now you have to show them all your receipts and all your records. There are other standards and methods that are designed with what's called a controls-based. So you design a control, and you don't show all the evidence, you just prove that the control is working. Now, these standards are far faster and more efficient to monitor, to implement at a utility, for example, or at an infrastructure. So what we have is control frameworks, and you just pick one, and then there are control tests that come with the control framework, and the auditor comes and audits the controls to make sure they're still working. And they don't care how you got there or what you did, they just want to know, are your controls still working? So that is the much more mature approach in regulation. Some regulations are moving that direction. We're desperately trying to move NERC-CIP there. It's been dragged, it's got a long history and a lot of pride of ownership from some organizations, but it will eventually get there. We're looking at some of the newer ones. We're hoping we can get this right on our gas and our chemical infrastructure in the U.S. because they're the next ones in line for regulation. So we're looking at controls-based monitoring methods there. But typically, it's not the regulation's fault. It's how it's being monitored and enforced that causes so much additional effort.
Daniel, Vanessa?
Yeah, I was thinking about, I think you mentioned the idea of emergence, right? And it brings you back to Taleb's idea of not being fragile. We don't want to create such a hard system that it becomes vulnerable, right? We want some sort of flexibility built in that allows it to evolve. And so if we want anti-fragile systems, we've got to find a way to do that in a more comprehensive way than just top-down systems, right?
Vanessa, last one?
I would say one thing we have to keep in mind is, and I see it all the time in my practice, and maybe that's going to be bad for my practice, but I see clients that will spend $50,000 in internal audit, external audit, and risk assessment to pass a standard, and their overall budget is $75,000 for security. So at the end of it, you get a certification. Am I better off as a taxpayer? No. Are the employees better off? No. So I think we need to make the difference between a standard, a certain maturity, and give the space the corporation or the organization needs to put the technical standards first. So if we make the governance a requirement, but not the technical standard a requirement, then that's a risk. We are going to have a risk of having all kinds of companies that are certified, but in the end, who do not respond to the risk adequately. So I'm always a little bit skeptical. I like doing that as a work, but I also like my client not to get breached.
Well, Patrick, Daniel, Vanessa, thanks for your thoughts on that question. It's a huge subject, and we could have spent another hour talking about it. But thanks, and enjoy Montreal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.